So, welcome everyone on Zoom and in person. I just keep tilting my head back and forth. So, we are discussing Buddhism for daily life, and it's the 7th day, I think. I lost track. I think 6th or 7th day, but there is a bit of a connection to what we have been discussing. So if you have missed the beginning, just there are some recordings, just look into that. But it's very simple, but we've been trying to figure out a $1 million question: why we exist, right? What's the reason behind our existence? How we approach that is that we wanted to see why we don't want to kill ourselves right now. And then we wanted to see what's our fundamental driver to exist in the world. So that we discussed a lot on that. So I'll not get into all the detail of that. But last week we discussed about disappointment and uncertainty, right? And to put it in a nutshell, just imagine this scenario that there's this kingdom where there are princesses and there's a king and a queen, and they have been very happy, but they have a nice clock tower, right? And that clock tower has nice chimes and sounds at every hour, and people become very happy just enjoying the sound. So one day what happened was, of course this is a made up story, I'm just coming up with it, right? One day what happened was there was a forest fire like now, and then the clock tower got burnt, and then the whole music was stopped for some time, and the king again built that clock tower. He got the same chimes, but people are not finding the same relaxing happy feeling like it used to be before. And then they discovered that relaxation, that happy feeling wasn't coming really from the clock tower, right? So I just gave a parable. In life, we have been looking for things from outside. We've been, the only way we know how to become happy is by looking at things through our eyes, listening to sounds from our ears, smells, tastes, and touches. That's how we know how to become happy. However, we looked at a sutra or a discourse from Buddha saying that is not the case. I came up with two terms, karma and kama guna. So karma is the equivalent of sensual pleasure. Karma means sensual pleasure. Kama guna means the ingredients for sensual pleasure. And he says that these two are two different things. They are not the same. And what it says is that images that we see from the eye is not the karma. It's not the sensual pleasure. It's just a mere ingredient of sensual pleasure. Now, it's very tricky. I don't want you to accept this hypothesis. Just live with it for some time and see if we can find a demarcation between the sensual pleasure and the ingredients for the sensual pleasure, karma and kama guna. Guna in Sanskrit or Pali literally means character. So guna is something which is innate to that. It's a property or a quality or a characteristic, right? So sensual pleasure is one thing, but the ingredients for sensual pleasure is something else. So the sights we see from our eye, the sounds that we hear, the tastes, the touches, the sensations, like again we were meditating on the different sensations on our body. So they are just mere ingredients. They are not the sensual pleasure, right? So what is sensual pleasure? Sensual pleasure is nothing but concepts in our mind. Now let's try to see if it's really true or not. We also discussed that in order to become happy, we interact with people, places, possessions, pastimes, and that's how we interact with the world. And while we interact with these people, places, possessions, pastime, we also give some meaning to them. For example, I have a few friends here, right? And you might have also met each other before, right? Some have not met each other before, some have met me. And each of everyone here in the Zoom You are not viewing the same Reverend Anand. Each one of you is looking at a different Reverend Anand. Is that right? Right? You are not looking at the same person because you are interpreting me in your own mind's interpretation. So some might hate me, some might like me, some might be just wondering who this monk is, but each one of you is interpreting me in different ways. Still, I emit the same amount of light photons to your eye and to your retina. It's the same, but still you interpret me in different ways. And the same way, when we interact with our five senses, we don't just look at it as it is, we try to give them meaning. And again, now probably you could relate to what we were doing during meditation, that I ask you to look at things as it is, without giving them meaning, without interpreting them, which is very hard because our natural method or our modus operandi is to keep interpreting things, right? When very unconsciously, in a very subconscious level, in a very primal level, we keep interpreting things, right? So what we interpret, we put one basket and call them the things that we like, and we put them into another basket and we say that those are the things that we dislike. So when we interact with things that we like, we are happy. When we have to interact with things which we don't like, we are unhappy. When the basket of like things are taken away from us, we are unhappy. When the basket of things that we dislike are taken away from us, we are happy. For example, I don't think anyone is enjoying the forest fire. If it's put out, we'll be happy. When it comes, we are unhappy, right? So it's very simple. Although it's very simple, that's what I said. The modus operandi, we haven't really figured it out. We have been just living the life without really thinking the mechanics, the basic fundamental mechanism of that. Now, what we are trying to do is not trying to come up with a new theory, but again, we are trying to look at it as it is, not because Buddha has said, not because some sage has told it, not because I am saying that, purely through our observation. And if it fits, we take it, otherwise we don't take it. But we don't reject it. So the fundamental in this teaching in Buddhism is that we don't accept, neither we don't reject. We just seek. We just go and dwell into the depths of it and try to realize it for yourself. So any realization here does not belong to any other person. It's a personal realization, right? So having said that, we also looked at, although we say this karma and karma guna are two different things, there's a very fundamental biological need which prevents us from having a clear demarcation between those two. The fundamental biological need is to survive, the desire to survive, from the microorganism, from COVID organism to the plants here, to the beavers, to each one of us. The fundamental need is to survive and to procreate, maybe, take our next generation. Like I was wondering, back in the day in that forest monastery, there were so many mosquitoes, right? And these mosquitoes, I felt so sorry because they have a short lifespan. They only live during the spring and the summer, and then they die, paving the way for new eggs to come, new larvas and new mosquitoes to come. But they only live for less than 4 months. So I let them drink some of my blood because I felt sorry. But having said that, there are some biological drives that, for example, why people like sugar and salt. Back in the day, it wasn't so accessible. Now we have loads of sugar when we open the refrigerator, but back in the day, sugar was precious. We only got it in the form of fructose. Salt was very precious. It wasn't very available. I don't know if you watch Discovery, there are these mountain goats who climb up a wall to get salt. Salt is elephants, they love salt. When I was in that previous cave temple, you can't keep salt in the temples because wild elephants, they love salt, they smell it and they come and try to, break the house and eat salt or sugar. So salt and sugar has been a fundamental driver in our biological existence. So unknowingly, we have an addiction towards that. But if you leave all that, we have other addictions, like addictions for our latest iPhone. Now, what biological drive is that? Right? So then you see that there's a biological component to it, but there's more of a mental component to it. So we are trying to separate these things out. And we will also use the word clinging. So we can cling to likes and dislikes, right? We were also discussing earlier the likes and dislikes, the preferences are not innately wrong, but it's just this clinging has an effect to it. We'll discuss it in later when we get into the more technical terms of Buddhism. And there's also what we can notice is that from these preferences, you might prefer coffee over tea, and then there will be a point where you will reject. I can only, so let's say that up there, when I went up, there was two Tim Hortons. One was double double, the other one was French vanilla. I have a preference to drink double double over French vanilla. So it's a preference. I prefer double double. But I could also say, I do not want to drink French vanilla. I completely reject it. That's a different level, right? And then there's a level I could demand, if I don't get my double double, I'm not going to do this session. So that's another level. And there's another level, I live for double double. My entire existence revolves around double double. So you might even see when you walk down the Gold Center, there are so many drug addicts. Their lives are around this addiction. Preference, I am rejecting the other one. I can't have it. Complete rejection. I must have it. Without that, I cannot operate. My life is completely around this particular habit. So you might think that only the drug addicts who inject meth, they are the addicts. But question yourselves, aren't you an addict of something else? It doesn't necessarily have to be drugs, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be a meth, but we are addicted to something else. And we are trying to figure out, again, we are not going to judge ourselves whether this is a bad addiction or a good addiction. Anyway, we are addicted to something. We are just trying to figure out what is our addiction here, right? So without really judging ourselves. And what happens is that often this addiction from preference all the way to addiction happens based on our like and dislike. And now your task again is to see if this like and dislike, are they stemming from a more fundamental biological need or a made up need? Like when I say made up, I'll explain you. So today the talk is about fear. I'll explain I'll explain the psychology behind that, which is available in the modern contemporary psychology, how these things work and how these likes and dislikes, where are they stemming from? How have we gotten to that? So what we do is, for sensual pleasure, we always thought that it's coming from the external world. But then the proposition is that sensual pleasure is nothing but a conceptual thing which you have cooked up in your mind. And that's how you can become happy. So you see that you are very much a slave of your own thinking. You can only be happy based on the way you think, right? If the external conditions doesn't match, you cannot be happy. So it's very normal when people complain that they are not happy, they are unhappy because external conditions would never match what's in here, right? So then it's very sensual. And then again, when we look at people, the next time you look at a person, just you have people that you like, you have people that you don't like. Just look at them and see how they have become likely people or disliked people. I'll tell you a few examples. There was this guy called Charles Ponzi. The Ponzi schemes, the pyramid schemes. Everyone hates him now. But when he initially came up, people loved him. They thought that he's the savior, right? So even nowadays, there are a lot of pyramid scams. When they come up, people do believe them. I have heard so many pyramid stories. They are very pushy and they want you to get into their pyramid chain. In the beginning, they love them. And when they realize that they have been cheated, they start hating them. Look at someone like Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, Snowden. Have you heard of that, the American guy? So some people believe that he has done something good. He was a whistleblower that has to be done. Some people believe that he was against the nation. He betrayed the nation. Based on how you think, he can be a good or a bad person. Look at our politicians. Yesterday I was talking to someone from Pakistan. They have this very loud figure called Imran Khan, who used to be a cricketer. People loved him, but now people hate him. I also happen to have a lot of Filipino friends. There was this guy called Duterte. A lot of people loved him. Now some of them hate him. Still some love them. Donald Trump. Some love him, some hate him, right? And it's based on what's your political polarity in here, right? Again, I'm not saying that there's no absolute good or bad in this world. There is some sort of a good or bad in this world, but then again, what I'm trying to say is most of the things that we perceive as good or bad are not really out there in a physical sense, but more inside here on a conceptual sense, especially politics. Everyone is not very human friendly. They are not the best advocates of humanity, but based on our view, liberal or conservative, we tend to look at them good or bad, right? And the next thing we discussed was expectations. So in expectations, we discussed that there are certain fair expectations. Like for example, I want my partner to treat me nice, which is an okay expectation. It's validatable, justifiable. But there are expectations like I want this lake to be frozen so I can skate during summer. It's not justifiable, right? So our minds are really cunning. We come up with expectations, but we don't come up with all the expectations possible. We don't expect the sun to come from the north every morning. We expect it to come from east. But we expect certain other things like this person has to be nice to me, the world has to treat me nice, and my colleagues, my peers, they have to talk to me nice. The monk have to treat you in a particular way that a monk should have treated. So we have these expectations. Now what we want to see is that is it really fair or unfair to have these expectations? Why? Is because in order for for us to expect something, we also need to know that it has to work the way I like. But what is really under our 100% control? I'm not saying things are completely without our control. There's some form of control. Like I'm thirsty now, I can drink this, I can take a sip of this water. It's under my control. But what is really under my control? Is the world under my control? Is the weather, forest fires under my control? My neighborhood, my town, my house, my yard, the weed which is growing in the dandelions on my green patch, are they under my control? My possessions, my computer, will it work all the time the way I want? Is my body under my control? My mind, is it under my control? Now when I say control, I'm not saying there's no control in that, all these things I mentioned. We only have a partial control, not 100% full control. But in order for us to expect something, it has to be under 100% control. And if that's not the case, that expectation is wrong, right? And again, what I suggested was we can't live without expecting certain things. When we expect certain things, know that there are two outcomes. Either it could go wrong or it could go right. Why? Because they are not under 100% control. So there's a chance of either could happening, right? And so again, in the world, there is no something called certainty. What is certain in this world is the uncertainty, right? We'll be discussing about the core Buddhist philosophy called impermanence, right? Impermanence has many nuances. The Pali word for that is called anicca, which another nuance is that what is certain in this world? Is our thinking certain? Is the weather certain? Is there anything that we can find 100% certainty? Or is the world, the nature of the world is uncertain? So in an uncertain world like that, all we have is wishful thinking. What we expect is nothing but wishful thinking. They could go right or they could go haywire. They could derail. That's perfectly normal. What happens is that when they happen, we don't accept that. Even though it's a very normal thing like sun setting and sun rising, it's very normal. Spring, summer, winter, it's very normal. We don't accept when things go wrong. We think that it shouldn't have happened. And then we blame other people, we blame situations, we blame governments. We like blaming other people, other things. We blame everything else but me. Right? Blaming myself is also not going to do you a lot of good. I mean, you can blame your partner and live with it. But if you start blaming yourself, that will be very difficult to live in that setup, right? So that's also not going to work. And we also found the main reason for divorce in Canada, which is getting married, right? So what I wanted to say is that our dissatisfaction or our disappointment is because we have expected something. Expecting itself is not a wrong thing, but clinging to that expectation is the part which is not so nice. We can't live without expectations. Like when I go and open my refrigerator, I expect there something to be in that, like milk or something, right? If not, I won't go there. But when I open, before opening, I should also know that there could be something, or it could be absolutely empty, right? So that's a more balanced expectation rather than being unipolar expectation. So today what we have to talk is fear. So I'll try to cover the fear, because fear is something we need to really understand. I always think there are two types of people come and talk to me usually: people who are depressed or people who are anxious. Depression is all about your past, right? You worry about things which are in the past. Anxiety is always about your future, what is going to happen to me in the future. So let's try to understand this fear. Now, if you lay out all the emotions in our mind, we have the happy, euphoria feelings, which are the positive feelings. They're okay to have, good problems to have. And when we have the negative ones like frustration, anxiety, anger, fear, those are the more negative ones. And if you look in a more biological manner, that when we get certain emotions like anger, they say that there's a lot of adrenaline and noradrenaline in your system, in your neurotransmitters, and they have a negative effect on your other organs like your heart. And when you're too stressed out, you naturally want to get out of that stress, and you keep getting into an eating disorder, stress eating. And the whole the body, the blood sugar, the blood pressure, they increase when this negative side of the emotions are there. So fear falls into these negative parts of the mind, not the happiness, euphoria, which is okay. This is more of a negative one. But let's look at different types of fear. Now we have the fear of sickness. Why? We would naturally want to avoid things. And, a couple of days ago, I met a lady who was perfectly healthy, very healthy, and then all of a sudden she was discovered with a very late stage cancer. So, when you get a news like that, you become afraid. So, naturally, we are afraid of sickness. And apart from sickness, we are afraid of a whole other things. We are afraid of ghosts, spirits, we are afraid of so many things. Now, I'm really trying to, like, as a kid, I was afraid of ghosts, right? There was this teledrama we love watching that, but we were so afraid after watching it. So we are afraid of ghosts. So when I became a teenager, when I grew up, I always wanted to see ghosts and spirits. So I always went to places where there were murders, these places which are haunted looking, stayed there, spent time there, waited until midnight. I've never seen anything. In fact, the most peaceful place in this area is the Mount Cemetery. There's a mount something. It's a cemetery down there. It's a beautiful place and the most peaceful place. Sometimes I take a walk and go there and sit there and just enjoy the sunset there. It's the most peaceful place. So your fears on ghosts and spirits, what if I say they are very cultural? Now, here in the West, people will be more afraid of vampires, the ghosts and demons which appear in the Bible. But in my country, there are different set of spirits and ghosts. And now I watched this very scary movie called The Nun. I think there's a sequel. I don't know if you have heard Nun. There's a movie. So in the movie, there's a nun who's possessed and bad spirit, etc., etc. The only way to control that demon spirit is by using the blood of the Christ, right? So there's a vial of blood of Christ in a deep down place. So that is the only way to control that demon. But the funny thing, that portion would not applicable in India or Sri Lanka, because these ghosts, they have a different deity, and they will be only controlled by that deity. So people are also equally relieved when their own deity comes and give that portion, right? So maybe there's some truth to it, but then again, when you look at movies like Blade, have you watched a vampire story called Blade? you know the guy in the Blade, the vampire in the Blade, he's not afraid of the cross usually, but he's afraid of silver, ultraviolet, and EDTA solution. EDTA solution is a chemical solution, so he's afraid of that. So you see that these fears, they are very much cultural. It's based on our imagination. And there's also another very interesting thing that they say, that between a crow and a monkey, a bird and a monkey, birds can't come up with their own concepts. So when there's a snake, the bird can make a noise saying that there is a snake. But the difference between a snake and a monkey is that monkey, even without a snake being there, he can alarm his fellow buddies that there is a snake. Right? So he can make jokes without something being really present. Birds, the more basic mammals, basic animals, they can only respond to what they see, right? But human, they can come up with so many things, even with that being present, or even that thing without being in the world, right? So the monkeys can only make their buddies afraid with the snakes that they have seen. But humans, we have so many things that we tell other people to scare them that we have never seen. Right? So that's the difference. It applies to a kid also. When you're like below 2 years, 3 4 age 3 4, you can't explain a lot of concepts. So again, our whole discussion about fear, about happiness, it's all revolving around conceptual thinking. So it's very important to understand how we change over time when we are a kid to adult, how we change our concepts, right? So fears, and the best way to again know fears is to read your insurance policy. It will tell you that if you have a life insurance, it will tell you 101 ways that you could die and how 101 ways you could benefit. Read your auto policy, or home insurance. That's how you get afraid, you get your fear, because it lists out these are the possible things which could happen to you. And the next set of people who would make you afraid are the voodoo doctors, astrologers. They like making you afraid because that's how they can earn some money. Maybe there's truth to that, I'm not denying that, but they usually like their clients to be afraid a little bit. So that's when they come and seek advice. For example, me, right? I don't do it, but I know people don't come to me when their life is good. They come to me when there's something that they need to fix. So imagine that I made a living out of that. My marketing should be to make people more afraid of different things. So sometimes we see that in cultures that politicians and priests, they do the same thing. Especially politicians, they come up with a threat which is not there, and they are the saviors to that, right? So it's very sociological. And apart from that, we have the fears of security, the financial security, job security, life security. And if you look at all these things, they revolve around me and my family or people I love. So anything which is mine or me, that is when I become insecure, my security related fears. And again, like I said, always try to see the psychological part of the fear and the physical part of the fear. It's very important to see the physical part and the psychological part. So what I always, when I was a kid, I always knew that the ghosts and the spirits, they never physically harm you. They can only mentally harm you. They can only make you scared mentally. They never physically harm you. That there are no accounts of physical harm, right? All the other things that I did in my life, like I was into a lot of outbound, adventure sports, surfing, kayaking, whitewater rafting, And I remember I was during my university I used to work part time in a outbound company, outbound training company. It happened in a river, and there's this place which is about 20 feet high, 16 feet high. People are supposed to jump to that pool of water in the river, and it's called the leap of faith. So it's a corporate team building activity, right? I have seen so many people, regardless of your gender, right? They are very afraid to take that leap of faith, basically to jump. When you have a vest, floatable device, even with that, they are afraid to jump. And I always wonder, I have jumped many times, and I always wonder the physical part of that. When you jump with a life vest, nothing is going to happen to you. And there are people around that. There's a security, there's a safety people around you. There's a kayak right next to you, so nothing is really going to happen to you. But it's so hard for people to take that jump, leap of faith, right? And I always wondered, how can some people become less afraid and how people become more afraid? And then I also wondered that, isn't this very, very conceptual, right? So I did a lot of surfing, but I am not a good swimmer. I'm like a very average swimmer. I've been to places where I could have easily died, but nothing happened to me. And maybe it's a chance, but there are a lot of things that you can do which doesn't really pose a physical threat, but your mind can be alarming, saying this is bad. So last winter, I take walks down this path in -20, wearing something like this with my bare head. Nothing happens. Maybe of course there's a physical limit. I can't do that in -60, or I can't do it for 2 hours. I can only do it for 20 minutes, 15 minutes. I've tried to meditate out there during the winter for about 15-20 minutes when it was -20 again. It's possible. So there's no physical damage, but we might be afraid, thinking that there is physical damage. So again, in a way, we need to understand what this fear really is. And if you look at it again, our life swings around this security and adventure, right? Fear is to basically keep you secure. But we do not enjoy being fully secure. We also need to go and find that adventure. And when the adventure becomes too bad, we again want to go into that, hide in that shell of security, right? We don't like life to become monotonous. So when COVID happened, people were very upset. Our life is too monotonous. There's no adventure in it. And I had to offer the same thing. My life as a monk is also very monotonous. I don't go in many adventures like I used to. And my advice was, monks' advice to fight COVID monotonous, that boringness of COVID. So again, we switch between spontaneous and monotonous. We don't want to be spontaneous when it's too adventurous in our life. Then we want to be monotonous. But when it's too monotonous, we want to be spontaneous and seek that adventure. And it seems like there's a continuous battle between this desire to find that adventure and to stay away from that adventure. So find this internal battle also, right? When we were teens, right, we liked girls, but there was a fear to approach them, and there's a likeness to approach them, desire to approach them. So our entire life, again, if you sum it up, it's between those two. In one hand, we have the desire to approach things, and on the other hand, we want to get away from things because they are not secure, right? So desire and fear are fundamental natures of our existence. And so again, when you look at fear, the biggest fear that one could have, I mentioned, listed out quite a few, but the biggest fear one could have is the fear of not knowing, unknown fears. Now, when COVID initially happened, everyone was so scared. I think this is the most that the world as a collective group, all the 8 billion people got so scared in the past few decades. The wars, we don't feel much. So they were very scared. But now no one is afraid of COVID. Why? Because now we know that this is COVID. So we are very much afraid of things that we do not know. And I remember before I came here, I went to a very haunted looking church in Sri Lanka. There are monks, they meditate, and a lot of people say that that's a haunted place. So I went and spent there with the other monks there, other priests there. Um, there was a little boy. He was telling me that he's very afraid during the dinner time because it was dark. He couldn't see things. But during the daytime, when we were having breakfast, he said, I'm okay now. And the difference is during night, you can't see. During the daytime, you can see. So it's not the real risk that you're afraid of. It's whether you know about it or not. Right? So you can be afraid about a saint who's not known to you, but you can be very okay to a devil that you know very well. In fact, there's a saying, right? It's better to the known devil is better than the unknown angel. Right? Something like that.
Yeah, better the devil you know.
Better the devil you know, right? Yeah. So the fear of unknown. Why do we hate this unknownness so much? Is because when we don't know, we can't control, we can't plan, right? We like certainty. In our existence, we love certainty. We like being able to control things, plan things. But the nature of the world is it's a mystery. We think that we know a lot about how our body works, how things work. A lot of people thought when I was a kid, I thought, well, Newton has discovered gravity. When I came to university, I discovered that he hasn't really, Einstein was the man. But then I figured Einstein even hasn't really figured out gravity. It's a whole different thing. So we have a theory right now, quantum theory, which is the best fit. But in some time, that theory is also going to be obsolete. And 100 years from now, people will think, how dumb were we to believe in quantum theory or theory of Einstein, So things are continuously changing, and the world inherently is not a very certain place. But of course, there are advantages of having this fear, because if we do not have the fear, we won't be able to survive as a species for this long, right? For example, I consider myself to be a stupid person in terms of fear. I'm usually not afraid. So that's why I expose myself to bad situations. And it's not a good setting if you are a family man or if you are a person who has to be in the world. I don't care for my life, so I'm okay with it. But if all the people in the world think like that, the species is in danger. So fear has its own benefit that it keeps us survived. And of course, because of fear, we have the society, the norms, the rules of the society. They are based on reward and punishment, right? If people are not afraid of the rules, there will be very bad credit scores, and the whole system would collapse if we do not have that. Some people, like sociopaths, they do not, simply because of their brain works, they can't feel that. Ted Bundy, I have been reading about the Brampton rapist who was there in the 70s, people like that. For some reason, they don't feel the same fear in their mind because their brain is different. So again, we looked at different stages of our life. It's very important to look in our life hindsight now that none of us are kids, right? When we were kids, we were just afraid of homework and punishment. That's what we were trying to get away from. When we were teens, we were afraid of rejection from your partner. When we were young adults, we were afraid of achievement or failure, fear of failure. Adults, fear of losing your dreams, a midlife crisis about losing your dreams when you can't achieve them. And when you come to the old age, you are afraid of your death. So every part of our lives, we are afraid of something. And then I said, remember when we were discussing happiness, I said that we cannot be 100% happy. There are inhibitions to happiness. The first inhibition is that we are afraid of, we can't be happy as we want because there's a punishment to most of the things which makes us happy, right? Or religions, they don't want people to be happy. There's a boundary, abstain from this, abstain from that. And there's the fear of criticism from others. So see that desire is there. At the same time, the fear is limiting us from becoming 100% happy. So fear, if you again look at it, something which is very close to fear is disgust. um, I have a friend who has a phobia for snakes. I don't know the term for that, but she can't even stand a photo of a snake, right? So we don't know what really caused it. But I know another friend who's been talking to me. She has a phobia for the bugs, like the flies and bugs, not spiders, just flies, house flies. And while she's perfectly okay with more venomous snakes, we don't have bears, but we have leopards, tigers. We are perfectly okay with that. She's very afraid of houseflies. And again, when we were having a chat about how she got into that fear, going back to her young ages, like age 2, 3, she had a person who was looking after her. That person was afraid of flies, and that's how it got transferred to this little girl. And now as an adult, she's still afraid of flies. And you could see that there's no apparent reason why you should be afraid of a fly. It's not going to kill you, but still you can have that phobia. And when you have that phobia, you react in a completely different way. So look into your phobias now. Again, we are always taking these stereotypical examples about drug addicts and phobic people, but each and every one of you, we also have a phobia. Maybe it's not defined in the classical DSM-5. You know what DSM-5 is, right? Diagnostic Statistical Manual. That's the book which says whether you are crazy or not, right? So DSM-5. So I also happened to come across another story of another person. A bit of a sad story. So that person got married, could not have a physical relationship because every time when you were about to have a physical relationship, it reminded of your childhood trauma, childhood abuse, and it could really affect your life. So what we do and what we don't do are very much based on the fears which is in here. So get back to yourself now. What I'm doing is only just pointing out a direction. Go and seek yourself in that, right, within this framework. And again, if you look at how these fears could go away, right, the fears could go away through habituation or desensitization. Like desensitization is basically you have a decrease in response to a certain stimulus because you are exposed to it with repeated times. So I remember I met a policeman. So in Sri Lanka there was a civil war, and he has to be placed in the north part of the country where there was a civil war, and policemen were targeted. Like if you stay in a corner, if the other guys notice you as a policeman, most likely they will shoot you. And then he was telling that over the time, I just lost that fear, because it was every day, right? So I wasn't afraid anymore because I sort of accepted it, and it became so normal. And again, there are so many documentaries about policemen, like SWAT, for example. SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics in America. I'm sure that Canada also has one. If you look at the daily life of those police officers, they are constantly exposed to these different threats, and over a period of time it becomes normal. So it's just another day at work, like we go and work on the computer, right? So habituation can occur. And another way for the fear to go away is desire. With desire, your happiness would go away, right? And again, another way to remove the fear is reward. I don't know if you have noticed the Survivor series. I don't know if it's still there. So the winner of the Survivor group, they get $1 million. For $1 million, they would do a lot of things that normally you wouldn't. So if there's a reward which is good enough, you would still come out of your fear. So I'm showing you the fear and the way to come out of the fear also. So there are many other ways to come out of fear that people do. Love. A parent would go in between a big grizzly bear and the child to protect her child. She's not afraid anymore. So love can overtrump fear sometimes. reward, $1 million. Or it can be even your ego. Someone says that you're such a sissy, you can't do that. And the boys, typically when you're a kid, you would go and dare do something you're very afraid of. So that's how people get over fear. So before going there, I also want to introduce a small thing today. So I don't think I can complete the entire fear part and what Buddhism says about fear, but I want to elaborate these types of feelings. So this is nothing that you don't know already. Everything I'm telling is something that you know. The only thing you need to do is to relate it to yourself, reflect on yourself, right? That's what we don't do usually. We know these stories. We know all the movies, Blade, Casper the Friendly Ghost, Survivor series. We know these things. We need to relate it to our own things. So before we understand fear, we also need to understand two things, that there are conditioning. In classical psychology, there's this thing called the classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Have you heard about it? It's very simple. What basically happens is that if you watch a horror movie, right? Have you tried watching a horror movie without the soundtrack? Just try to watch a horror movie without the soundtrack. It does not give that full effect. In fact, sometimes it might look funny, right? All the scary and disgusting movies, if you turn off the soundtrack, they don't become so scary. And in a typical ghost story, you would have that creaking door noise, right? So we are conditioned, right? From our childhood, we are exposed to these things, and we are conditioned to these things. So I don't know if you have heard of this behavioral psychologist called Pavlov. He had a dog, and he trained the poor dog. So every time a bell rings, he would give the dog the meal, and then he did not give the meal to the dog, but he still kept on ringing the bell, and the dog was there was saliva in his mouth. So we also get trained like that. It's called classical conditioning. That's why people who are in front of me here are behaving in this manner, because you are conditioned to behave in such a manner in a temple, in a monastery, right? This is not your conditioning at a nightclub. It's a different conditioning. It's not your conditioning in your parents' house. Different conditioning at school. So it's called classical conditioning, and our fears are very much related to this conditioning. There's another thing called operant condition. I don't want to get too deep into that. Some of you might already know. So based on reward and punishment, you can train people and make people afraid. For example, in an office corporate setup, you have your performance appraisal, right? People are afraid of that. That's when you are going to get appraised, right? So in order to survive, you change your behavior because there's a performance appraisal. In the kindergarten, you give stars. Good kids get stars, the bad kids get black stars. Back in our time, we would get black stars saying that you're a bad kid. Now you don't do it anymore. But it was more rough as kids in the past, right? You would get more reward and punishment, more black and white reward and punishment. We have conditioning through religion, because we cannot forget culture and religion. They are a big part of our life unknowingly, right? Depending on how religious you are, right? You can be very afraid of certain things, and not afraid on what you eat, what you wear, how you think. It is very much affected by the conditioning from society. And again, the guy who was doing a lot of work on this operant conditioning is B.F. Skinner. He always used to tell that our lives, we do not have a free will, right? That was his, he believed that we don't have free will, we are just conditioned. We are just a being who are conditioned. And the question I have is that if we are the puppets, we are being controlled, who's the puppet master? Who's pulling all the strings here? Now that's the question that we need to figure out, right? If we are conditioned, who is conditioning us? Who is behind this conditioning? Is it our parent, our teacher, the principal, or who is conditioning us? And who's the true master of our puppetry, right? And The next part I think I will quickly cover before the last 10 minutes is that so this from Buddhism, which is very close to Buddhism. And now for everything I mentioned here, there's a Pali word and a Pali discourse, but I don't want to bring out and extract that because you're not going to understand. So that's why I'm trying to relate it to the more contemporary knowledge from behavioral psychology, sociology, etc. Another thing that in order to understand this conceptual nature of mind is we need to understand the behaviors. We have innate behaviors and acquired behaviors. So they say that sneezing, when there's something itching, when there's something allergic, we have a sneeze reaction. When we drink water and when it goes the wrong way, we cough. That's a innate behavior. We don't think and do it. It's very involuntary. And when it's called you shiver, it's involuntary and it's innate behavior. When I say innate, it's in you. It's not a learned behavior. But fears, when it comes to fear, we also have certain innate fears, at least innate fears. So the fear of pain, no one would love the fear of pain. You want to get away from that. So you are afraid and you want to avoid it because you have an innate resistance or a rejection towards fear. Survival instinct. We have an innate survival instinct. Like, there's this, again, a behavioral experiment. Some ducklings were shown a gooselings were shown a goose and a picture of an eagle. They are innately more afraid of the eagle picture and they don't respond the same way to the friendly goose picture, their mother's picture. So when you invert the picture, it looks like an eagle, and the little ducklings, without knowing anything, they are afraid of that. So they believe that that's a more innate fear rather than a learned fear. They say that mammals, they hate snakes, right? And next week I will tell you the significance of the snake who appears in the Bible, who appears in the Vedic text, right next to Shiva. So mammals, they hate snakes. And why? In fact, if you look at all the religions, all the cultures in the world, we find snakes. There's Apollo and a python, right next to the Hellenic philosophy. Apollo is next. There's the python who's always not in good terms with Apollo. There's a god called Ra, who's the sun god. The Ra, or the sun god, is always in conflict with Nebaku, who's a serpent. We have Shiva, the god, in Indian philosophy, Vedic philosophy. Shiva has a garland of snakes called Vasuki, so he's right next to it. Buddha, if you find in certain statues, there's a snake called Muchalinda who's on top of Buddha. He's a huge giant cobra. So Adam and the serpent, right? So you find serpents and snakes in all our religious texts, cultures, etc. Now, why is this snake so important, right? I'll tell why Buddha had the Muchalinda, why Shiva had the garland of snake Vasuki, and why there was a snake in the Garden of Eve right next to Adam and Eve. I'll tell you why, the reason. But the theory is that they say humans are innately afraid of snakes because they probably used to attack people. So it's built in our DNA. People are also afraid of birds, big birds, because there was a big bird a few million years ago who ruled the world. People are afraid of fire or hot, the hot surfaces. If you put those things together, the snakeness, birdness, fire, what do you think you get? You get a dragon, right? So again, if you look into our contemporary movies, the hero of most of these movies is the one who can slay the dragon. So hero is the one who can conquer the deepest fears or the deepest innate fears. And that's why the Lord Shiva in Vedic philosophy, he's wearing that, the serpent is resting on his shoulder because he has overcome his own innate fear. So he's beyond that innate fear, right? There's the Muchalinda snake right behind Buddha, because he's not afraid. He has overcome his innate fear, right? So that's how the snake appears in all these spiritual texts. And so the learned fear. Learned fear is your teacher saying, don't do this, or the government saying, don't do this. This is that's a learned fear. Cultures, based on your religion, culture, we get learned fears. But then I also wanted to point out that there's another part, which is an innate part of the fear. And so this is about fear. I'll tell you one last thing before I wind up today, and then next week I'll tell the Buddhist version of what's the fundamental factor of fear. But an interesting way to look at fear, if we need to deal fear, is to look at the fear versus risk. Now those are two different things, right? Fear is a psychological phenomena. Risk is a phenomena which is more statistical. Right? Now again, let's take COVID. When COVID came, I'll tell you a personal experience. In 2000, I can't remember, 2003 or some time ago, there was a SARS virus, right? And I told you, they say ignorance is bliss. I'm a very stupid person in that way. I don't feel fear a lot. So when there was SARS virus, it was in Hong Kong. People stopped traveling to Hong Kong. So there was Cathay Pacific. They said, we are giving you an offer, business class ticket with 3 nights stay in a 5-star hotel, very cheap, right? And then I did not know what SARS is. I googled and looked at what SARS was and how many people have died due to SARS. It was about 800 people, right? I thought there's 7 billion people in the world. For you to become one of these 800, it's a very low statistical probability. So I'm going to take the ticket and go to Hong Kong. So I did that, right? So when COVID came, a lot of people are very afraid. The first thing I did was I went and looked at the figures in the very early stages in March 2020. The death rate was 4% at the time, right? And that was a very acceptable risk for me. 100 people, 4 people dying is very acceptable for me. Back in the day with Black Death, it was 50-50. They say about 2/3 of London died because of Black Death. That's something you should be afraid of. But when you look at the COVID figures, if you go now, I didn't go recently, but the Canada average is in the 1,000 to 1,300 per million. And the world average is about 800 deaths per million, right? Now, what does this 800 deaths per million signifies in a more statistical sense? We need to understand what a million is. Now, 1 million is a really huge number, right? We don't come across huge numbers in our daily life. So these numbers become very unfathomable. I'll tell you the easiest way to identify a million. If you take a piece of paper, put 100 dots on a piece of paper and encircle that 100 dots. If you draw 10,000 such circles, that would be a million. So it's a huge number. 1 million is really big. So 100 dots, encircle it, 10,000 circles like that is 1 million. And 800 people have died per million, right? What does that signify is that out of these 10,000 circles that you have drawn, 8 are gone and there are 9,992 circles remaining. So that's a pretty low risk to die out of COVID. So I used to tell these monks here when there was in the height of COVID, I'm very sure that I'm not going to die of COVID. It's because it's a very statistically low probability. Maybe because when I was, again back in the day when I was an engineer, when we had to plan factories, we always had a risk analysis, a risk matrix. So I understand risk is one thing, fear is something very different. Fear is very psychological. It's a psychological phenomena. It's not based on the actual risk. It's based on psychology. I'm sure that you must be knowing that a lot out of what all the work you do. And risk is a statistical phenomena. It is something you can calculate. So again, if you need to look at your life or work around your fears, look at the statistical part and leave the psychological part. So that's sort of the key underlying message in the entire discussion. We need to separate between karma and karma guna. What's mental and what's physical? What's fear? What's statistics or risk? So separate these things out, and then you might start seeing the world in a different way. It's not so bad. It's not so scary. It's just as it is. There's nothing to be disheartened when things don't go right. Maybe we can find a more blissful way to live the life, right? So with that, I will call it a day. I'm sorry that I was talking too much on the fear, but I thought it might be interesting to cover these bases before we really try to understand what Buddhism is. Again, we are not trying to understand Buddhism from a 2,500-year-old set of words. That doesn't make any sense. Whatever the religion, whatever the philosophy that was valid in that knowledge system should be valid now. So whatever we discuss should be from this knowledge system, what is more familiar to you, right? So I often have the accusation from most of the Buddhist who comes to me that I don't talk Buddhism. Right? Buddhism is not in the words, it's in this underlying message in trying to understand the works of the nature. When I say the works of the nature, the works of you, right? So with that, I will call it a day. If you have any questions, ask me. If you are afraid of asking questions, there's no risk in it. Right? So I think what I said was quite straightforward. I just pointed things out. All you need to do is try to reflect on these things and try to see what is your inhibition, what is your addiction, what is your fear, and let's try to figure out why we exist at the end, because that was the first original question. Okay, so with that, then I'll call it a day, and I wish all of you a very peaceful, blissful evening. And let's try to figure out a way, like Buddha, Shiva, Adam and Eve, how they conquered the fear of snake. Let's also try to conquer the fear of, not snakes, all the fears and anxieties. Right? So good evening to you, and take care.